Some of these people pass me in the halls in the Capitol, and I can tell they're listeners. And then others pass me, and they're like, "Hey, how you doing?" I was like, "Oh, he doesn't listen." He would know not to say hi if he listened. Welcome to the Georgia Politics Podcast. I am Preston Thompson, your host for the last 2 weeks of Georgia news. And when I thought we were going to take off every other week, I thought that was going to balance out our news quite well. It didn't work this time. We've got a full, dense set of topics we're going to get to. We're going to run through them all quickly. Let me first go around the room and introduce our moderators. On my left here, let's start with Hans.
I'm Hans Appen, Appen Media Group, Appen Podcast Network. Thanks for having me, Preston.
Well, it's your building, so.
Yeah, well.
This is Craig Kidd, first vice chairman of the Fulton GOP and chief of staff to the mayor of Johns Creek.
And my name is Charlie Bailey. I was the 2018 Democratic nominee for Attorney General, and now in private practice an attorney at Cook & Conley.
First time for Charlie on the show. Thanks for joining
Welcome,
us.
Charlie.
You can send your bill to Hans, and I'm sure everything
it's your
will work out just
show.
fine. Well, yeah, but listen.
My pleasure to be invited.
Thanks for being here.
Okay, let's start.
Actually, can I ask our new guest an odd question?
We're already getting
Did you
into it.
ever meet the other Charlie Bailey? Do you know who I'm, you know who I'm
the
talking to
Decatur
about?
attorney? Or are you talking about the one that ran
I'm
against
talking about the guy.
Kathy
I'm
Cox?
talking about the guy who ran 7 times in the
Against
Republican.
Kathy,
He ran every 4 years.
I think he
or
ran for
something.
Secretary of State 3 times.
He did.
And a bunch of other stuff.
He did.
I've never actually met him. I know who
Okay.
you're talking about, but I've never actually
You never met him? Well, he died.
Mm-mm.
But-
But you know,
I didn't know.
he was alive back when I worked for Mark Taylor in 05,
Okay.
06, and nope, never met him.
Okay.
I have talked to the Charlie Bailey, that's an attorney in Decatur, and every now and then people will call him. And he's like, "Hey, there's more than one Charlie Bailey. It's an attorney in this state."
No, when I saw you qualify, it brought back a lot
You're
of
like,
memories.
"Oh God, is it that guy?"
Yeah,
now?"
PTSD.
No, I knew he was R.I.P.
He switched parties,
But no, Charlie, the other Charlie was a very eccentric, very friendly guy.
yeah.
I'm sure we have both of those in our Charlie here today.
Yeah.
All right, let's get to the most obvious piece of news that's happened since we last met. Stacey Abrams opts out of the U.S. Senate race, and that was, of course, immediately after we finished recording. Yeah, there were audible tears coming from you.
Did she ever opt in? I guess it would be my
Well,
question.
I guess that's a good point. We can talk
Thank you.
about that, but let's talk about first just what that does for this race in general in terms of how likely it is to win. If we want to get into candidates then too, I guess we can. But let's start with our resident media guy here in the room who was just crying about it. So.
Well, the chances just dropped a lot, in my opinion. So I was thinking about this a little bit after that news broke, and set aside the idea of who is most able to beat David Perdue now that Stacey Abrams is out of the race. Part of what I was thinking about is that for Democrats in Georgia, this is going to be viewed as a letdown. Like there were a number of people who were excited about the potential of Stacey Abrams jumping back into another race and putting Georgia back on the map. And to a certain extent, they're going to be disappointed and a bit, unenergetic about whoever ends up being the nominee. So that's part of what I was thinking about.
Craig, does this change the way David Perdue positions himself at all, or was it just whoever I'm running against do the same thing?
No, I think Perdue would run the exact same campaign that he would run regardless of who the Democratic nominee was. His opposition research might change a little bit, but other than that, he knows what he needs to do to win, and I think he'll stick with that.
He has to be thrilled, though.
Well, I think he's very happy simply from a money standpoint, but I'm of the perspective that the Democratic nominee is going to be tied to the Democratic nominee for president to such a degree that I'm not sure that the vote difference is going to be that much. Basically, my point being is how many people out there will vote for Trump and then vote for Ossoff, for example?
Mm-hmm.
There's not going to be a lot of ticket splitters.
Or the other way.
Or the other way.
Yeah.
We're in an era of non-ticket splitting. You see that every 2 years. And I just think this particular race, the Trump factor, et cetera, is just going to magnify that.
That's not what I'm worried about. I'm worried about the Stacey Abrams voters who are going to stay home because she's not in the race.
You don't think that the disgust for Trump takes care of that?
It didn't in 2016.
I don't think that's going to be a concern. I think people that were motivated by Stacey's run, and I was right in the middle of it. They're voting in 2020. There's going to be an increase over that. I mean, it's a presidential year. We're going to have a lot more Democrats out. There's going to be more Republicans out. That's what happens in a presidential year. And I agree with Craig. I think that because it's a presidential year, David Perdue's going to be tied even more so to Trump, and whoever's the nominee, whether it's Teresa or John or whoever else might run, is going to be probably pretty closely tied to the Democratic nominee. And as long as Trump is well under 50% in Georgia, which is where he is, then it's a battleground. It's a battleground presidential, and it's a battleground for the U.S. Senate. I would have loved to have Stacey run. I like Stacey, and she's a friend. But I think Craig's also right, and the biggest difference is in the amount of money in the early stage. A lot of these U.S. Senate, once it's a toss-up or a battleground, money kind of flows into these things. I mean, you saw that in Missouri, you saw it in Florida. You're going to see it in Georgia, as long as we've got a legitimate candidate.
Yeah, I pulled up the election results from year 16, because that's when we had the last presidential and Senate, thinking that the margin was going to be closer to help underline my point. It doesn't really undercut my point. I mean, Johnny only got 46,000 more votes than Trump statewide. Now, you can't conceive of two different kinds of politicians more than Trump and Johnny.
Sure.
Johnny is the most popular Republican probably in the history of the state of Georgia. The biggest actually letdown was how many fewer people voted. That's actually the biggest thing. It would have been about 200,000 fewer people voted.
Well, and I was going to mention that. I mean, we were talking about Hans mentioned, do they get the same turnout without Stacey on the ticket? There's a lot of data that supports that when you've convinced someone to vote for the first time, you've broken the dam on the rest of their life. And doing it in a midterm, I would think, only accentuates that. So I would think the amount of new voters she turned out, whatever it is, I don't have the number in front of me, but the amount of new voters, first-time voters she turned out, I would think a lot of those are likely to come out again, whether it's for her or somebody else, because you've kind of broken the barrier and you've convinced these people that Georgia can be competitive, and that was her whole pitch. You're also saying, is this race going to be the same with Stacey Abrams not in it? I don't see a Senate race happening that she's not in it somehow, right? Like she still finds a way.
It's not the same.
Well,
it's not the same.
No, it's not the same, but she finds a way. She's going to support whoever the candidate is with everything she's got. I actually have concern of, does she somehow overshadow that candidate? What if she introduces the candidate at an event or something like that, and you have people there that's saying, well, we kind of wanted Stacey, almost like, Michelle Obama introducing Hillary at the Democratic convention. Like, boy, wouldn't Michelle Obama be nice? Like something like that, I think, is something they might have to be worried about.
So Carolyn Bordeaux would agree with you. I interviewed her yesterday, and she's running again for the Georgia 7th. And I asked her that question about Stacey Abrams not being at the top of the ticket in 2020 in Georgia races. And her reaction was kind of the same thing, that Democrats are going to be able to make up for that by it being a presidential year. So turnout will be higher. So therefore, that will help mitigate the loss of not having Stacey Abrams on the ballot.
Well, also what we saw across the country, it wasn't just in Georgia where you had a historic midterm turnout overall and historic midterm turnout among Democrats. That's something that played out all across the country wherever you had anything close to being competitive. What that tells you is that everywhere, including Georgia, most of what happened was tied to the national environment in terms of the demographic shifts that went on. And one thing a lot of folks, Stacey got a higher percentage of the white vote than Barack Obama did either time he ran. She also got a higher percentage of the Latino vote and of the Asian vote. She got a lower percentage of the African-American vote, which what that tells you is her gains were made among whites in the suburbs and women and people that have college degrees. which is, again, and among Latinos and among Asian Americans, which is what played out all over the country, which tells you Georgia, what happened in Georgia is not a one-off, but it is a microcosm of what's happened everywhere else.
Craig, David Perdue, unlike sometimes Johnny Isakson, has very much aligned himself with the president, who has hovered somewhere between, depending on who you ask, 43 and 49% approval in this state, something like that. Do you think tying himself so closely to a pretty divisive figure, is that helpful? Is that harmful? Does it just balance itself out?
It's too late. I mean,
Yeah.
if the gist of your question is, will he soften
Change.
that support or change during the campaign? It's too late. He's already tied at the hip. If he retreats from that support in any sort of noticeable way, he will hurt people on the hard right, on the right side. They'll still vote for him, but if this is going to be a campaign about enthusiasm, then you don't want to mess with that enthusiasm. So he won't change one bit. That decision was made back in 2016 when he threw all guns in.
Well, and there was a model we just saw of Brian Kemp winning an election based on bringing Trump into the rural areas, right? And you know, not that he completely didn't care about the suburbs, but his time was spent elsewhere. So I think there's a model that shows that could work, I suppose, again.
I think, though, that the Purdue people are different from the Kemp people. I think they recognize that they need to do better in the burbs than Governor Kemp did, and I think there'll be an effort to that effect. So every side learns from the previous cycle, and I think that's something they'll do a much more detailed job on.
Before we move on from Stacey, I think we would be remiss if we didn't say that it's not an impossibility that she will still be on the ballot in one way, shape, or form.
Sure.
Is John Lewis retiring? Is that...
I think he's referring to VP or president.
Further towards the top of that ballot. I mean, I think, Hans and I were talking about this before the show, and Craig is our history buff, so halfway through this sentence he's going to interrupt me and tell me I'm wrong.
Well, we did talk about that last session about the Abrams and the VP ship.
But historically, in large presidential fields, and we haven't had that one this large in a little while, but in large fields, there's a tendency to pick the vice president from someone outside of the primary field for a lot of different reasons. Now, this field is so large that may not happen this time.
It might be impossible.
Right. But in terms of Democrats with lots of name recognition and lots of power within the party that aren't running for president yet, assuming she does not decide to go that route, there aren't a lot of people left that you're looking for vice president, especially if you're trying to, for lack of a better way to say it, check some boxes, right? Check a box with the constituencies of that party that are likely to come out and vote, which is minority women.
I think she gets on the short list automatically.
Oh, definitely.
I mean, so there's a.
She'll
it's hard to game out with this many candidates. Like, what is the percentage chance? I mean, who knows? But she's on the short list.
She'll have to be, even if she's not actually being chosen. She'll have to be on the short list just for form's sake.
The short list is a move in itself.
Exactly,
yeah.
and you make a good point. I mean, the last time the number 2 guy was made the VP, the number 2 guy in the primary race was made the VP was John Edwards in 2004, which really isn't that long ago. But if you go back even further, nobody was expecting Dick Cheney. Nobody was expecting Joe Biden. Nobody was expecting Dan Quayle, Geraldine Ferraro. I mean, I could go on all day with this.
And more recently, that crowded Republican field that we had in 2016 made
no one was expecting Palin.
You have to go back to John Kennedy. And,
Pence. Pence was always sort of lingering around because of his ties on Capitol Hill.
And the short list for that race changed a lot because of the kind of unwillingness to choose people who just came out of that crowded primary. I think there were maybe 1 or 2 on the short list, but yeah.
And that's where the personality of the president comes in, or the presidential nominee. Ronald Reagan did not like George H.W. Bush, but he recognized the value of what he could do. Sure. I don't see Trump, if he didn't like his VP nominee, I don't see him choosing that person as a VP.
An interesting story about Reagan choosing H.W. Bush, too, is it was going to be President Ford.
Yeah.
It was going to be Gerald Ford, and then Gerald Ford. And this is during the convention, went on TV, and he was asked the question, was it really going to be more like a co-presidency? And he's like, yeah, you could say that. And Reagan was like, get HW on the phone. There ain't gonna be no co-presidency around here.
Yeah, you can blame Kissinger for that co-presidency thought as well. And it's a shame it didn't happen from a poli-sci perspective, just to see if that could have worked.
Presidents, yeah.
I mean, you would never have two equals, but if you 75-25 with the president obviously being the name on the paper, it would have been an entertaining dynamic.
Yeah.
And then what ifs is the greatest thing of history of all time. And then if Ford was the VP, and then what's his name was actually able to assassinate Reagan, then you'd have Ford president again. Two different times under two different presidents under two very different circumstances. I mean, Jerry Ford would have been the ultimate footnote to political history.
Right. A bit of an aside. But.
Yeah, a bit of an aside, but yeah, let's move
That's
on.
the fun part. We're talking about different
Yeah.
But before we move on,
You've already done that.
Can I
Well, now that Abrams is out, we need to talk about who may get in.
That's actually a great point. Yeah.
Well, that was kind of what I was doing. I was going to send a little red alert out to Sal Yates. If you're listening, we need you. Please run for Senate.
Craig can make historical references, and I can make Star Wars references, where you're saying Sal Yates is our only hope. Yeah. Go ahead.
I can do both.
Okay.
I can do Star Wars references and Game of Thrones if you want.
So, I mean, let's talk about the people who are likely to get in. Sally Yates has pretty much said no. She's still getting asked in a way as if she hasn't said no.
That was before Stacey Abrams said no.
I suppose, but even some candidates were saying, like, I'm going to wait on Stacey. It's a no if Stacey. So, like, she didn't even give that kind of qualifier. I think she just said no across the board. But she's made a couple press appearances.
So did half the Democratic field for president.
Sure.
Too.
She's made a couple press appearances. It wouldn't absolutely shock me. I think she's an interesting candidate. Teresa Tomlinson, of course, is already announced. Former mayor of Columbus. She started to raise money, and she released a more official announcement after Stacey decided she wasn't going to run. I think before that she had an exploratory committee or whatever it is. And then I think, like Charlie mentioned earlier, we're also looking at former District 6 candidate John Ossoff, former Lieutenant Governor candidate Sarah Riggs-Amico, worth noting State Senator Jen Jordan, who had come of some kind of quick fame after the HB 481 debate, has said she is not going to do it. And I think she has her sights set on some other things. So out of that field, does anything shock us? Does anything really change? I thought we actually might see more announcements quicker after Stacey said she wasn't going to run. I'm surprised we still only have the one.
Well, it's been a week. When did Abrams jump it?
Well,
decide not.
I would like to think if it was more than 2 weeks, we would have talked about it last time we had the show.
Let's say 10. It's been 10 days.
Sure,
but I agree with what you're saying. I'm surprised there hasn't been more people heading that way. If I might take a leap, I think if Ossoff gets in the race, I think he'd be remarkably difficult to beat.
Really?
I do. For one, can you pull up that map? For one very simple...
He's got the map right
Well, no, I thought about this. For one very simple thing, the Atlanta media market, which we're pulling up here, comprises all of that territory. Now, Ossoff spent $30 million. I don't know how much of it on TV, but let's just say 25. $25 million on media that goes to all of those counties. And for the people listening to this, basically it's everything north of Macon.
It's everything the light touches.
Now,
almost.
That's probably 75% of the Democratic statewide primary field.
I would,
maybe,
if not more.
Maybe 70, but probably 70 to 75. That is one hell of a head start that he's got. It's a heck of a handicap. People in every one of those counties already know that name because they saw God knows how many commercials of his. So
it's an interesting point. I mean, and I'm speaking as someone who has worked on campaigns and who follows kind of the nitty-gritty of campaigns. There might be an issue in the primary of, are we going to nominate someone who was the most spent on congressional candidate in this nation's history and still came up 3 points short in a race that a year after flipped?
Yeah, no, that's easy though for Ossoff or for Ossoff supporters to write off. I mean, the Democrats did win the 6th, but it was still a great victory. I mean, it was still unexpected. So it's not like Ossoff lost the 5th to a Republican, and then you could say it was really, oh my God, he was this terrible general election candidate. He really lost.
Who in your perspective would be the scariest for David Perdue then? Is it Ossoff then?
I really don't think it matters. I mean,
you think it all plays out?
Campaigns are personalities, so you can't take that out of a campaign. But I'm going to double down on what I said 10 minutes ago. I really think that there is this set vote locked in, and you swing a couple tenths of a point either way based on personality. But assuming that somebody isn't a criminal, I really think this vote is really locked in.
A couple tenths of a point would actually
It could.
be enough to
I
swing.
don't think it's going to be that close. But point taken. I mean,
Sure.
I really don't think if it's these three guys. If it's these three people, I mean, my joke is, being the Republicans, you three Dems can wait. Where's the African American candidate?
Well,
I mean,
another name that's being
just
thrown
announced
around.
that she's not running.
Well, another name that's being thrown around is CEO of DeKalb County, Michael Thurmond. That would throw a big wrench into this, and I think he would jump out to an immediate powerhouse. I don't know.
Would it?
Mike,
Charlie
well,
knows him
let
better
me
than
preface one with I'm friends with all these people. So,
That's why you're here.
yeah.
Tread lightly.
Teresa was one of the first people to endorse me right when I came out, and John supported me. Obviously, I was on the ticket with Sarah, and I'm friends with the CEO, with Mike, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for him. I think if he were to get in, and I haven't talked to him about this. I've heard the same whatever rumors. I mean, I think he's run for U.S. Senate before. He was a statewide elected official. He's highly respected both within and without the party. I think he would start out as a front runner because, I mean, he was labor commissioner for at least 8 years, and maybe even 12 years. I mean, it was a long time. And he's done a great job in DeKalb County, and DeKalb County is the most important county for us in the primary. That doesn't mean it's Mike gets in and it's over, but I think he probably does become an early front runner at that point. I have no idea whether he wants to do it or not.
I've heard him be asked the question in the last couple weeks, and it hasn't been a no, but it also hasn't been a I'm exploring all opportunities. It's somewhere in the middle, right?
Yeah.
So I suppose it's still possible.
I think it's whether it's someone we're not talking about, which there probably will be people we're not talking about that get in, whether they're in the legislature or they're elected city council or mayor somewhere or something like that. There'll be other people that get in, but of the four we're talking about, I don't know that there's obviously differences in them, in their backgrounds, and I think Craig brings up a good point. Most of this, I mean, it doesn't matter who knows you under the gold dome and how many lobbyists are your friends. What matters is, do the voters know your name, which is why when you run statewide, you got to raise so much money. Nobody knew who Charlie Bailey was at all before I put $1.1 million in TV.
Well, they knew the other Charlie Bailey.
Yeah, maybe they did that guy. So the point about John having name ID in Metro is a good point. But any of these four, I think, would be very credible. They would be very good candidates. I think they're going to have to raise. I mean, U.S. Senate campaigns, you got to raise at least $20 million this year.
Sarah Riggs-Amico, with her business background, brings an interesting perspective to me, but I do agree with everything that's been said about, how little variance we're actually looking for. I've mentioned it all the time.
I don't know that that's always true. I just think for these four, I mean, those are the ones we're talking about.
And I had mentioned it before on the show a bunch that in this Senate race, there was an A tier and there was a B tier, and the A tier only had one person in it. So I don't think a lot changes between these candidates. I think it'll be an interesting primary, though.
The one time I heard Amico speak, which was during a GMA conference, I was very impressed with her, and so was my mayor and some of the other councilmen who were at the table. I hate phrasing this way because, unfortunately, I have a down ballot statewide candidate here at the table, so I don't mean this in an insulting way.
I don't take offense. Go ahead.
People don't pay attention to down ballot races. Sorry, phrasing.
You talking about name ID for Sarah
name
Amico?
ID. Yeah, no one's ever heard of Sarah Amico. I mean, I apologize. I don't mean to insult her or anybody down ballot, but I used to work for the Public Service Commission, so I know all about how people don't know who's who down ballot.
It's a lot harder to break through.
Yeah, so I don't think Amico, even though having a statewide race, has any name ID. And I think it was even worse this year or last year because the Abrams race was so intense that she soaked up every bit of possible news on the planet. I don't know if you ever felt maybe it was unfair that she soaked up so much. I remember when Jeff Duncan beat David Schaefer on the GOP side for LG, people were concerned, as was I, that he might there might be some gaffes, that he was gaffe prone. He might say something. And I said, so few people are going to be paying attention to this LG race. Nobody knows anything about the LG's race. All he has to do is sit down, be quiet, and he'll win. And to his credit, he did. Yeah. He didn't do anything wrong. He ran a great campaign, and he won. Well, so I just don't see Amico having any kind of
not any more variance than some of the other people we're talking about.
She does have some name recognition. I know because I've seen the polls because I had a poll because I know what my own is. She does have some because she spent about I don't know $300,000 or so on TV in the primary. Spent another $300,000 or so in the general. That gives you something. It's not 30 million or 25 or 20 or whatever John's number was, but it was something. So there's some, but your point's taken. It's not. She certainly doesn't have Stacey's name ID, just like I don't have Stacey's name ID. I mean, Stacey spent $40 million.
The same thing for Tomlinson. I mean, no one's ever heard of her outside of the Columbus
She has
area.
the nice benefit of an early start, but
sure.
I'm not sure how much that actually gives her. But I think people that were looking for somewhere to go after Stacey said no, only had one declared person to go to. So Hans has got one more name for us, and then we're going to move on.
Well, before I give you the one more name, I want to pose a question to Craig, and this is an additional point. Craig, if Johnny Isakson were to announce tomorrow that he was resigning from Senate, how many Republican candidates?
Question.
How many Republican candidates would be in the field within a week?
None, because the governor would appoint his successor, and they wouldn't challenge him.
Okay, you read my question.
Follow the hypothetical.
Follow the hypothetical.
To its end.
Okay, fine. I'll rephrase. If Johnny Isakson announced that he were resigning at the end of his current term, how many people would announce within?
You mean retiring at the end of his term?
Yeah. Right. How many people would be in that Republican field?
He's literally counting them name by name, which is how we know this answer will be good.
5.
Just 5?
What was your expectation?
5.
5
real candidates.
So what I was trying to make a point of is I think that this field of candidates for the Democratic nominee for Senate shows how weak the bench is in Georgia for Democrats. If you look at it, if these folks jump into the field, you're looking at 2 people that lost their elections.
This coming from the Beto fan.
Their most recent election. Stop it. And I think it highlights how much the Democratic Party in Georgia, how much work they have to do.
I suppose, but when you haven't held a statewide office since Craig help me, like 2002,
Thurber Baker,
2010,
yeah,
2010. I'm not sure where else you pull from. I think mayor of a rural town and failed lieutenant governor candidate, those seems like very natural places to pull from for these kinds of candidates when you don't have anywhere else to go.
I mean, Hans makes the point that has been going around for several cycles, is that because the Democratic field has always been remarkably weak, which if you look long term illustrates how successful the Democrats were in 2018, because now they can build with some more attractive candidates. I mean, I said it last time. As much as we here in Alpharetta like to talk about the blue wave, we do have to remember that the Democrats did lose every race statewide. So in 22, they have to find a candidate for LG, AG, SOS, insurance, labor, ag. Where are they going to pull those guys? If they're smart, they'll look at some of these guys who won elections last year in 18 in some of these swing suburban areas and say, hey, Jen Jern, how would you like to run for AG? My apologies. Et cetera, et cetera. Why don't you run for LG? Why don't you run for insurance? And they, two terms in the legislature is not a base, but it's a much better start than they were in 2014.
That's exactly the point I was trying to make, is I think it's certainly better positioned now than it has been historically. I think if you look at what this kind of opportunity could have looked like a couple of years ago, you'd see the same number of candidates in the Democratic field, but the name recognition would be lower, that history would be lower. I think this is actually, for where we are, not a bad field.
Devil's advocate. I think that's one of the reasons we may not see a Lucy McBath, run for Senate or for a higher office, because when's the last time a Democrat held the 6th district ever.
Well, it would have been
You have to
pre-Newt.
go-
Pre-Newt, you'd have to go back to the
Yeah. You gotta go
80s.
back to
Yeah.
yeah.
So
Well, the map was redrawn, so you'd have to factor that in.
Right.
kind of
The modern 6th district never.
kind of the point being that I think a lot of these Jen Jordan, Lucy McBath, the party has fought so hard for those seats. There's going to be hesitation to encourage them to run for higher office and leave that seat vacant.
I disagree that this is a weak field right now, and I'll say again that it's. I mean, we're 10 days, 2 weeks out from Stacey saying that she's not running. I mean, we don't hold any statewide offices. By its very nature, you're not going to have any statewide candidates running. I would venture to guess the 5 that Craig came up with that might be running. I'd guess that 3 of those are congressmen. And he's not. So I agree. You know, so
Right.
At some point,
Where else are you going to pull from?
Something's true until it's not, right?
Where'd David Perdue come from?
Well, but the Republicans have held this state for so long that having a bench is easy. It comes naturally.
Well,
how do you build a bench as
that's
the
my
Democratic
point.
Party? But it's not. We can't change the numbers, right? Like you can't just go in and say, okay, this is now a Democratic area because we changed the minds of 15 percentage points worth of people. There's only so
I
much
think
you can
Carolyn
do.
Bordeaux would disagree with you.
Well, we can get into Gwinnett County
Why
and all
doesn't Carolyn
that. but-
Bordeaux run for this Senate seat? She
Maybe
has just
she
as much
will.
chance as anybody else on this list.
Can she
It's a
do
fair
that?
it's a fair question, but
Yeah.
I don't think she could do that. I don't
course
think
she
she
could.
would.
Well, I'll tell y'all now, I'm not running for the U.S. Senate.
Thanks, Charlie.
okay.
Of course, all she would have to do is call the people who have given her money and say, "Hey, instead of running for the House, I'm running for the Senate. Can I transfer
we
the
should
check?"
we should also ask you if you're running for president too. Because
I'm
that's
not
the,
running for
that's the
president.
natural follow up. Okay.
I don't want to belabor the point. If you want to move on, and this is the Republican at the table asking if. I would imagine that the African American Democratic community is looking at this field and saying, "Why not one of ours?"
On that point, Hans.
On that point, we are failing to mention one person who has been rumored to be considering a run for the seat, and that's Pastor Raphael Warnock, the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church.
I thought the pastor said he wasn't going to run.
I'm looking at this article from AJC dated
It's constantly updated. So
April 30th.
The only
So
reason
about a week.
the only
And you
reason
said he's still thinking about it?
Yeah.
The only reason why I would hesitate on that is simply because he's been mentioned now probably for 3 straight cycles of running, and he just, to his credit, he
mentioned a lot.
hasn't jumped in. So
Again, that was before Stacey Abrams said she was not running.
well,
Well,
it's-
if I know the pastor, and if he ran, he'd be a very formidable candidate. I don't know if y'all ever heard him give a sermon, but it's a
Special.
powerful thing.
Who would you give the nod to as far as a competitive advantage, him or Michael Thurman?
Oh, I think Mike starts out in front because
they both would
much higher name ID.
when you have a lot of things you can point to in DeKalb County, right? Of like, look what we
So,
did.
I mean, ultimate hypothesis here.
Yeah.
But since you played out the Reagan Ford hypothesis with me here, or hypothetical. So let's say the good pastor does jump in.
Mm-hmm.
Does he get 95% of the African American primary vote? 90%?
No,
So high.
I don't.
80%? If he gets 80%, he wins.
I
African
think
American is 50% of the vote. He gets 80% of it, he wins.
If he jumps in with a field that doesn't have Michael Thurman in it,
Yeah, yes, no Thurman.
I think it's just extremely hard for anybody to get 80% of any vote, just by the very nature of the way people are. I mean, certainly, if Pastor Warnock was the only African American in the race, I think as long as he could raise the money to get a message out there, then yeah, you're going to bet on him winning certainly a strong plurality, if not a majority, of the African American vote. 90, 80, I think that's extreme. That's just extremely hard for anybody to do because you know African American voters, same as white voters, same as Latino voters, they're individual folks with individual thoughts, and they move along the political spectrum. So it's not an automatic. That
And
you
I
get
think
that
you-
kind of-
What percent of the African American vote did Stacey Abrams get?
against Stacey Evans.
Against
in the
Stacey Evans,
primary?
and
That's a good
you're
point.
talking about
That's my point.
and you're talking about somebody who on paper has a better I can't imagine to the African American community a better position than being the head pastor at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. You might as well be the head priest at St. Paul's, or excuse me, St. Peter's in front of a bunch of Catholics. I mean, it's just
It is. I mean, it is certainly one. Well, I can't remember exactly what Stacey Abrams got in terms of percentage of African American vote, and I just can't remember. But one, there's going to be more candidates than just a one-on-one, which does change the dynamic. Two, undoubtedly, he comes in with an advantage there. I will just stress that not. The black vote, the African American vote is not monolithic, and so they don't all think one way about anything in particular. So for many, the historical reputation of Ebenezer carries a whole lot of weight. For some, it may not carry as much.
But you are correct that nearing the number you threw out might be enough just to win. Okay, guys, that was 30, 35 minutes.
35 minutes into
on one topic. We are 1/5 of
maybe
the way
that can be
through.
episode 1. We'll move into episode 2 here.
Okay, let's move on. I think Daniel's looking up some research for us, but we don't.
I think
we'll
I'm
get to it at
looking
the
up
end
the
of
same
episode.
thing and I can't find it.
We'll get to the end of the episode. Let's get into something that to a lot of people is understandably more important than what we just talked about, which is the state of relief funding for Hurricane Michael. Now, I was hoping that I would put this on the list of what we're going to talk about today, and I would kind of let the wish be the father of the thought that we'd have some good news to come back with. But every time it looks like we're getting a little bit closer to a deal, something happens, something comes up, and we're just as far as we were a couple weeks ago. I know David Perdue and especially has tried to tie himself to this. Today, the House just passed a package that probably will not pass. The Senate is still working on a passage that or a package that could pass, but I think most of us here at the table know the holdup to this. But Hans, do you want to get into it for us?
Well, and I was trying to think about this a little bit and take any kind of partisan hat off for a second. And I think this is part of why people hate Congress so much right now.
Washington is in general.
Yeah. Because why can't we have a vote on support for Puerto Rico and then have an additional vote on support for Hurricane Michael victims? Like, why do we have to make this so partisan? It doesn't have to be.
Well, there's one individual this is the easiest fix of all time.
Mm-hmm.
And if David Perdue, U.S. Senator David Perdue, wants to show that he is the real champion by the way, I grew up on a cattle farm in rural Georgia. I understand. I grew up around these folks. I understand what this means. I mean, it is not that far from where I grew up, where the crops have been wiped out, and it's going to be sometimes, 2.5 years before they can get back. You're talking about, pine tree farms that are, it's going to be a lot longer than that. You're talking 5-6 years before they can start getting saplings back up. David Perdue could solve this right now, and he calls President Trump, who's very close to him, and says, just release the money. Release the money for Puerto Rico, and it's done.
But they were very close to an agreement last week, and in part because of negotiations on behalf of David Perdue, and they were very close. But then a message from the White House came out that says
I just said, right?
We're tacking on $4.5 billion of border security spending.
Which had nothing to do with border security.
Of course not.
It's
So
to kill the deal.
Kind of the same thing. Like, why do these things have to be connected at all? Why can't we have 3 separate votes?
Well, I was just
Puerto Rico, Michael.
I was just making
Georgia,
the point that David Perdue has been in negotiations, and it seems like he's walking this line that every legislator in Washington is walking between his relationship with the White House and his relationship with his state.
With his voters?
With his voters. And of course, this goes back to my point of this is something that people get frustrated with Washington about. And there's, Hurricane Michael relief funding from the state got passed, what was that, last November? During a special session. Do you remember the vote count on it? Does anybody?
I'm sure Gertler was the only one who voted no.
Well, it wasn't very close.
I know for a fact he was.
But it was not even really a question. You came in, and of course, they don't have the Puerto Rico dynamic that gets, of course, thrown into it.
What this comes back to is the president of the United States doesn't think Puerto Rico is a part of the United States of America, and whether that shows a cultural, ethnic bias or ignorance, that is the problem here. I mean, he is. We have sources where he's been in meetings and he said, "Well, this is for some other country." And I mean, when the president of the United States is saying that, where's anyone supposed to go on it? I mean, that's the problem. He doesn't view it as being equal, which is why he's not approving the money. And so now we're stuck. So until someone can convince him, and the only person I can think that might be able to is David Perdue, until someone can convince him that he's wrong and that that's actually costing lives and you're supposed to be protecting lives, then we're going to sit here.
Well, this has gone so long that it's not just Georgia anymore. Kemp co-signed a letter this week with 9 other governors, Republicans and Democrats, that they're hurting in the Midwest for flooding. They're hurting in California still, I believe, like Alabama certainly. So it's everywhere. I just want to throw out, as soon as I saw that letter, I was kind of looking for some representative of Puerto Rico, and I don't know if that's just because it's an official letter from governors or what. I don't know, but that
They
person
have a
was
governor.
yeah. This is kind of what I was saying, but that person was not on there. But this has gone beyond the scale of Georgia in a really kind of terrible way.
So, and I want to raise one point to Charlie's point about David Perdue, and kind of in the context of 2020. So, let's say he fails in convincing President Trump to get this money allocated towards these disaster relief efforts. We recently just saw there's 3 U.S. congressmen in Georgia, Buddy Carter, Austin Scott, and Rick Allen, who were on the fence voting yes or no, but leaning yes, who have now said they're voting no. My question is, how much will that hurt them, I guess, in the ballot box in 2020? Is this an issue that could turn people's votes?
Which U.S. reps are we talking about?
Well, let's stick specifically to David Perdue.
Oh, okay.
If he fails to make this happen, if he is looked upon as a failure in getting relief to Georgia,
then yes, I think it will hurt him significantly, which is why it will not fail. Whether it's President Trump who finally relents and then says it was his idea all along, and everybody declares victory, which is what presidents do. Mm-hmm. Everybody declares victory. I don't know if it's going to be Mitch McConnell, who wants to remain Senate Majority Leader and therefore doesn't want to lose David Perdue's seat. We'll make the deal, and then the bill passes through veto-proof majorities on both sides, and then Trump says, "Oh, it was my idea all along." Everybody wins. Going back to but why can't we have 3 separate votes thing? This, 2 thoughts. 1, the sausage metaphor, and 2, everybody wants to win. There's a reason why omnibus budget bills keep getting bigger and bigger. They never get smaller. Same principle.
You're not able to promise that if we pass a bill on Georgia, then a bill on Puerto Rico is going to come up at all.
I hate saying this.
Mitch McConnell has proven otherwise.
I think the money will get through and everybody will take a victory lap. The reason I hate phrasing it that way is that would have been a good thing to do 2 months ago too.
Really.
So I don't know why we're doing this in May as opposed to doing this in March.
This used to be the third rail, I guess is the expression. It used to be the thing you don't touch, because you can play partisanship over, even immigration. Like when you talk about national security, you can play partisanship over that. But it used to be, says the youngest guy at this table. But it used to be that when stuff like this happened, you came together, you passed it, and you went back to whatever you were squabbling about 20 minutes ago.
Well, it still is the thing you don't touch. And Craig is right. I mean, I think I think they will pass something, because it won't just be Senator Perdue's seat. Someone's going to get in there with a PowerPoint and show the president that he himself is going to lose Georgia if he blocks this. And that's when it's going to change, because what we know about Donald Trump is he's not really conservative or liberal or libertarian or anything else.
He's Donald Trump.
It's the party of Donald Trump. And that's the one motivating factor that'll change his behavior.
Well, just to make it purely crass and cynical, I mean, other than the African-American counties in southwest Georgia, both Trump and Perdue need to rack up majorities of 75 to 80% in those other southwest Georgia counties. Well, clearly you're not going to get that if this thing drags out or fails.
You won't.
So you mentioned earlier, Craig, that there's not many examples of a driving issue that would create a split ticket. Is this an example where you could see a split ticket.
I think if it doesn't pass,
But
people
they're on
blame
the
Trump and Purdue
yeah, they both
together.
get blamed.
It'd be more, yes, but in a very narrow way. I mean, I was reading an article about why are Iowa farmers still backing Trump when the trade wars are hurting the farming industry. Well, it's because there's other things that affect their voting as well. And you could probably say the same thing about Southwest Georgia farmers. However, that same broad political thought process may not extend to the U.S. senator.
Purdue would have to come out and say, I've tried as hard as I possibly can to get this passed, and the president himself is the only reason it hasn't gotten done. I don't see that.
He's not doing that.
No. But that would be, in my mind, what would create that split ticket. Okay, well, David Perdue has done his absolute best, and he's still going to keep fighting for us, so I'll vote for him, and this president has blocked it, so I'm not going to vote for him. Whatever. I want to close this topic by asking Hans a question, and part of it comes from a personal frustration, which is I read the paper every day and I listen to podcasts like crazy. I'm a huge news junkie, and we have talked about how this is the place you used to not go. This is the place you didn't play your hackery on, your partisan hackery on. Every time we bring up this topic, and it's not just us, so I won't only throw us under the fire, but we immediately jump to how does this relief package play in David Perdue's chances for re-election. Now, we can talk about the president because, as Charlie mentioned, the president cares a lot about electoral politics, and we can get into that. I'm talking specifically about David Perdue. Are we in part to blame, and I'm using the ethereal we here, are we in part to blame for the gridlock in that when David Perdue goes to make this plan, he's thinking about this in election terms because we started thinking about this in election terms? Like, did this really start with people in Georgia and people with loud megaphones saying this is now an election issue when it, didn't necessarily have to be? Or is this just, is this the responsibility of, McConnell and Pelosi and the gridlock? Is it still them?
Of course. Yeah, we are a part of the issue. Us having this conversation on this podcast is a part of the issue.
Well, the conversation could have just stuck to people are hurting and they need the relief now, and we don't care how it's done, just get it done.
We've had this entire conversation about Hurricane Michael, and not once have we mentioned that there are people who have been living in tents for 7 months. And I think the human component of a disaster like this gets lost in this political back and forth, and it's quite frankly, it's the most important thing. It's the thing we should be talking most about. I was reading an article earlier today about a vigil for the shooting in Colorado that was essentially disbanded because it became a politicized event. And I think that's that kind of speaks to your question. In Colorado, right after this shooting, the most important thing to do is to make sure the kids who are traumatically affected by an event like that are okay. And we've seen that in Parkland. There were 2 suicides recently from children who have been diagnosed with PTSD from the Parkland shooting. You can correlate moments in time like that to things like this with the Hurricane Michael issue, where we need to keep in mind that there is a real human toll on issues like this. And it's something that if we can't come together on something as important as that, what can we come together on?
I think that is a sentiment shared by a lot of people right now.
Sure.
So I want to move on. We don't have much time left, so I'm going to do a host move. I'm going to audible. Each one of you is about to own one of our 3 remaining topics. We're going to start with Craig, the historian. A couple presidential candidates on the Democratic side have come to visit Jimmy Carter. Most recently, we've had Pete Buttigieg. Before that, we had Cory Booker and Amy Klobuchar. Should also note Cory Booker, I think, was taken to that meeting by John Lewis, or at least he was also here to see John Lewis, so that could play a role. But I'm curious, as someone who, graduated high school and what role does Jimmy Carter play in this Democratic primary process? Maybe how is it different than President Obama, too, or President Clinton?
I don't see Jimmy Carter bringing any votes along. It's like going to pay homage to the retired king.
You kneel and then you go do the other work.
You do your thing and then you move on. I don't think anybody, if Carter endorses somebody, I don't see that swaying much.
A question related to that. Is this an important question because Georgia is seen more of a purple state in 2020?
I don't, again, not being the Democrat at the table, and definitely not being a rural Democrat, even though there aren't too many rural white Democrats left.
There's a few of us.
There's a few of you. I don't know in Georgia what Jimmy Carter's endorsement would mean in a Democratic primary.
You don't think he's the
I just
shiny
don't think he
anymore?
carries anything anymore. I remember when Max Cleland endorsed Joe Biden last week or 2 weeks ago. I thought for a moment, I go, what does that really mean? I mean, Cleveland hasn't been in office in 17 years. There's a lot of people who don't know who the heck Max Cleland is, which is a damn shame.
I do
but
think
I just don't see it.
it's part of the checking of the boxes, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think it carries the same weight, as Craig was saying, as a visit with, if you saw President Obama has visited with exactly 4 of the 19 candidates or something like that in a primary setting, then that carries a lot more weight. It's like, okay, he picked these people and not these people, or these people have met and not these others. I don't know if it carries the same weight with Carter. I found it, I mean, a lot of these meetings take place in faith setting, which I find very interesting too. I mean, that's like a whole new dynamic that I think Pete Buttigieg is trying to bring to this, and going to Bible school with Jimmy Carter brings an interesting dynamic.
Well, that still plays in Georgia. It doesn't play well in Brooklyn, but it still plays well in Georgia.
Well, unlike the Republican Party, Democrats don't always think of the Democratic Party as the party of Brooklyn. I think AOC is the congressional representative for every Democrat when I look at a Republican mailer nowadays.
But Brooklyn very much could have been Philadelphia, Kansas City, Detroit,
Sure,
Chicago, LA, Houston, Seattle.
I'm getting all the advertisements from Republican candidates now, and I'm tired of being called AOC. So anyway,
So I personally think it's less to do with the person behind these visits, President Jimmy Carter, and the idea that endorsements they're overrated. I don't think they mean anything.
Agreed.
I will say, with one exception, President Barack Obama, when he endorses somebody, I think that makes a difference. And my guess is, with Joe Biden in the field, he is not going to endorse somebody.
Yeah, agreed.
My only question is Jimmy Carter a superdelegate?
Probably.
There you go.
I would think if you're elected president,
so.
you're automatically
I don't know.
superdelegate.
Anymore, who knows? Got to wait till the second ballot
I do think I think in a Democratic primary in Georgia, Jimmy Carter still matters. Of course, not to the level of President Obama. There's nobody that matters to the degree that President Obama is. But there's a lot of people having raised money from a lot of them that still have a lot of fondness and friendship for Jimmy Carter. And if he did endorse, and I don't know that he's going to, but if he did endorse early on, it would enable whoever that person is to raise a good bit of money, particularly in town Atlanta.
It's not insignificant.
That's not insignificant. It's not President Obama.
Right.
It's not insignificant.
The problem is there's no way to test it. I just went back in my brain about when was the last time Carter's endorsement might have.
No,
I was thinking maybe 2004. Do we remember who he endorsed in 2004? Did it matter at all in Georgia? I mean, Hillary versus Obama had so many other things going on that in Georgia was a slam dunk for Obama, so it didn't even count. But I was just going backwards, trying to think of when was the last time
he endorsed President Obama, but I don't know how early it was, because you had John Lewis switched his endorsements.
Yes, that's the thing. One thing everybody remembers.
Yeah, John Lewis was
Ted Kennedy.
And Ted Kennedy was that was a huge one when that happened. President Carter did endorse President Obama, but I don't know when it was. I don't know if it was before those or after those. I just can't remember.
I wonder if he endorsed John Edwards, Southerners, and then considering Edwards' later problems, that'd really be funny.
I'm not sure.
All right, moving on. Next topic, Hans.
Yes.
The NRA has a new president, and that president is from Georgia's 6th congressional district. Now, the president of the NRA is largely a kind of symbolic or ceremonial role. They have a lot of power and weight, but they don't have a lot of administrative authority. That president was changed to Carolyn Meadows after a lot of kind of infighting within that organization. They've got some things, I guess, they're trying to work through. I'm not a card-carrying member, so I wouldn't know. But Carolyn Meadows, longtime activist in the 6th district, it took her all of an hour to get asked questions about this district in particular. Does this bring that, the Second Amendment conversation back up here?
I suppose, but we just saw a candidate for the 6th district flip her district for the first time in at least 40 years, essentially running on, additional gun restrictions in the legislation. So I don't know. I don't know that the Second Amendment argument is what it once was, especially here in the 6th district.
But it's a very interesting, if we're talking about it's a ceremonial role or whatever it is, it's a very interesting face to put on that organization, because it's not a perception I think they have been able to maintain more recently of, we're not just the party of, people you're going to accidentally run into in the woods. Like, we're also the people who walk into their church in Cobb County, which is where she lives, and are carrying inside their church. It's an interesting move they're trying to make to appeal to those kind of suburban women.
Well, there is I would never be able to quantify it, but I know a number of women, particularly young women, who are very adamant that when they're on a college campus, they want to be armed because they have no faith that the security of the campus will help them. The cops will arrive too late, and they feel it is as much of their right to be armed as anybody else. Now, I'm not saying that's a majority, nowhere near it. But the idea that
I promise you it's a minority.
I agree it's a minority, but it's still a very passionate issue with these ladies, and they're just as much right to have the feeling as before. So I agree with what Hans was saying, that I think in the 6th CD, it's not going to be as much of an issue. I imagine the NRA's influence will continue to be in the areas where their influence has always been. If Austin Scott, for example, has a viable Democratic opponent, that's where the NRA should flex its muscle. The 1st congressional district in South Carolina, the one that runs along the coast that a Democrat won last year, that would be one that you could flex your muscle in the northern part of it, not the southern part of it. I mean, it's nice. I know Carolyn was. I met her many years ago. I can't say I know her, but I've met her. She's a very nice lady. But I don't really see much of it affecting the 6th CD. My kudos to the reporter who immediately made the connection to ask about the McBeth.
Right. Yeah. It's a really interesting tie that we're probably gonna see that debate play out all again, and possibly between those same two candidates, between Karen Handel and Lucy McBath.
The most interesting part of that is that the NRA apologized. I don't think the NRA's apologized for anything in my lifetime. I mean, I'm serious. When they were, some of the most, and again, I'm not saying, I grew up on a farm, but I grew up on a farm and we had plenty of rifles and shotguns and everything. And these folks at the NRA, they didn't apologize when they accused Parkland students of being paid actors. They didn't apologize when they dabbled in conspiracy theories about Newtown. And to have them apologize for anything, I think is that struck me. Well, they should have. I mean, it was
Carolyn Meadows is not a Neanderthal, for lack of a better term. She is a intelligent woman who recognizes the value of certain public relations moves, or humility is fine. Yeah.
No, I think it's an interesting face to put on that organization, and you're right. She made some sort of comment about, somebody asked her why Lucy McBath won that race, and she's saying, well, it wasn't about gun control. Lucy McBath was a minority woman, and in her comment, which to Charlie's point was not the most egregious comment they've made in the last couple of years.
No,
it's a comment. It's a comment that you sometimes hear in back rooms of Democratic consulting agencies.
Thank you. I was actually about to say that if it had been a Democratic state rep who said the exact same thing, no one would have blinked.
Well, she sounded like a consultant. She said Lucy McBath won because she was a minority woman.
I view that as a racist comment. But I'm not saying, I'm not going to get into the whataboutism of who, if someone said, I think I remember hearing people say that President Obama, the only reason he won in 2008, and the only reason he got elected in 2012 was that so many African Americans came out and voted for him. And I was like, I don't even think you realized how what you said was racist, but it was. I mean, to say that the only reason someone wins is because of their gender or because of their ethnicity, I think it's really bad.
To her credit, she came out and apologized. And she did not take long. It took like a day, and she said, it's a lot more nuanced than I made it believe, and I'll do better.
And which I gave her credit for. That she apologized. I think.
I was jumping on your train too. Okay. Last topic. One of the reasons I was excited to have an attorney in the room is so we can talk about what's next for Georgia's heartbeat bill that was signed on Tuesday. There's going to be a court challenge. We've known there's going to be a court challenge for a long time. I'm not, totally sure where it goes from here. Charlie, give us your insights on that.
This kind of bill's been challenged at least 2 other times, Iowa and I believe Mississippi last year. Both times, within a matter of weeks, there was an injunctive stay issued by the federal district court judge, and ultimately was struck down on constitutional grounds. I expect that will happen again, no matter which judge they draw in the northern district.
Now, the weeks you're talking about, though, does that start now, or does that start like law effective date, which is sometime January 1? So does that start then? Then you start the process of it? Okay.
Yes. So, I mean, because doesn't go into effect immediately, you might be dealing with a different kind of a different timeline in terms of litigation. There's nothing to stay right now. Those other, and I'm not sure, those others, they may have been gone into effect immediately, and maybe that's why they had that injunctive stay. Regardless, I don't think any person, including my many Republican lawyer friends, believe that this law is going to not get struck down as unconstitutional by the district court. And I believe that anybody in the 11th Circuit would probably affirm that decision. The play is, of course, as everybody's been saying, they want to force the Supreme Court to take it up. I don't think this current court's going to take it up. So, I mean, I could be wrong there.
If the current Supreme Court were to take it up, what's the timeline you're looking at there? Like, are we talking, within, the next presidential term, or could it be longer than that?
I mean, if they decide to take it up, it could be. It probably wouldn't be ours. It would be one of the others that's already been struck down. It could be next year. That would probably be the earliest. But I think that's very unlikely. I think it's very unlikely. I mean, look, the current state of law, Roe v. Wade and all its progeny, is that in the first trimester, government can't interfere. I mean, it's plain as day. In the third trimester, the government can interfere pretty much as they want to. And in the second, it's a mixed bag with different standards. And that's where almost all of the case law since Roe has been centered on that second trimester.
Well,
but this first trimester, I mean, which is what this is, you just can't do it. Not under Roe. You can't do it.
So that was going to lead me to my final question, because I've heard some people being confused about this, is can this law and Roe v. Wade exist at the same time?
No.
Okay.
You'd have to overturn it. And that's because a lot of people think, Roe just said abortion is legal. What Roe said was this is the framework by which government can regulate abortions. That's what it said, and it set it up on a 3-trimester thing. And the reason this is so different than other kinds of restrictions is it was taking place because it's restricting in the first trimester. I mean, I'm clearly not a woman, but from what I've read and from what I know, many women don't even know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. I mean, they don't know, and so you're effectively it is an effective ban. So no, they can't. You would have to find Roe unconstitutional in order to uphold the legality of this law.
Gotcha.
If the pro-life endgame is to challenge Roe, why doesn't the pro-choice community go to state court? Is it just because liberals haven't gone to state court on controversial issues for decades? What's the reasoning there?
You can still get to the Supreme Court through the state court. The way it happens is you go, Superior Court or state court, and then it goes to the state court of appeals, and it goes to the state Supreme Court, and then it's appealed from there.
It takes significantly longer, though, doesn't it?
Not necessarily. I mean, it depends on the jurisdiction you're filing in.
It just interests me as a non-attorney that the Democratic interest groups always go to federal court on every issue. Well, and I mean, historically, I can sort of appreciate why, But it doesn't even seem like the state courts are even ever considered on these type of things.
Well, when you're talking about the U.S. Constitution, I mean, then it's not that state court or superior court judges or judges on the Court of Appeals or the justices on the state Supreme Court are not capable of making those kinds of decisions. But the federal bench certainly deals a much higher level of expertise in dealing with federal constitutional questions. So I think that's probably why those end up where they do, because they're going to get there eventually.
So, Charlie, I have a question for you. So, when a state passes a law that is clearly unconstitutional, what is the state's attorney general's role in defending or...
And to add some context to that question, State Senator Jen Jordan submitted a letter to the Attorney General's office, Attorney General Chris Carr, asking whether or not he thought, in the opinion of the state as the state attorney general, HB 481, the heartbeat bill, was constitutional.
That is a very interesting question, Hans.
Okay.
It's a disagreement that my opponent and I, the current Attorney General, Chris Carr, he and I had on a number of issues. My belief and my interpretation is the Attorney General is even different than a federal Attorney General. The Attorney General in each state is slightly different. But in Georgia, we've actually got one of the strongest constitutionally and statutorily Attorney General's offices. So you're created by the Constitution. You are independently elected, independent of the legislature, independent of the governor. You are solely vested, and this has actually been ruled on because back in the mid-2000s when Sonny had beaten my mentor, Roy Barnes, and was governor, but Thurbert Baker had been reelected, Governor Perdue said, hey, Thurbert, you need to do X, Y, and Z on this redistricting litigation. And General Baker said, I appreciate your input, but I'm good. I got this. And it went up in the courts, and it was held that in Georgia, the Attorney General decides what is the legal position of the state of Georgia, full stop, period. Doesn't matter what the governor says, doesn't matter what the legislature says. So my view of it is, and I think it's pretty clear, that your duty is to protect the Constitution and protect the people of Georgia. Yes, you also defend the state of Georgia when the state of Georgia is sued, but that's where duties come into conflict. And my view is I'm never going to stand up in court and never going to have any of my attorneys stand up in court and defend something that is unconstitutional. That's a violation of my very first oath. And so what Chris should have done, and we disagreed on when it came to the debate of pro-choice and Roe and these kinds of issues. We also disagreed on RFRA. He thought he had to just defend. If they passed a RFRA legislation, he just have to defend it, and that's just not the case. Actually, what you're supposed to do is make an independent judgment about the constitutionality of the statute. If it's unconstitutional, you're not supposed to defend it. Now, that doesn't mean it goes undefended in court. What happens, and what happened with Sonny and Thurbert, is the legislature and or the governor goes out and gets counsel to represent their position, because they have a separate duty and they also represent the people of Georgia.
Just not the Attorney General.
It's just not the Attorney General and the Attorney General's office.
Do you have any confidence at all that Chris Carr would refuse to defend that heartbeat bill?
No, he has a different view. His view is whatever, and I'm gonna put my spin on it, but whatever boneheaded thing that the legislature or any bureaucrat does in Georgia that he has to defend. That's his view. It's an incorrect one, but that's his view. So he will defend this, full stop. And it doesn't really have anything to do with what he believes or not. He's just going to defend it.
Craig, last word on this topic?
I think it's a fascinating issue on what exactly the role and responsibilities of the Attorney General are as a non-attorney. I feel particularly incapable of entertaining that particular argument. Just sitting here listening, it's sort of funny listening to when is a law unconstitutional? Simply because somebody calls it unconstitutional doesn't make it unconstitutional. So when does when does a bill become a law? When does a law become unconstitutional? So that would be an entertaining conversation
when it
to have.
directly contradicts precedent.
But that's your opinion. That's not you're not a judge.
Well, and that's the thing.
So,
it is a judgment, right? It's not a mutable fact.
Right.
It's a judgment on the law.
No, and I understand, and I'm not saying that obviously courts should be invalidated, but I know we're way over time here. But when Jen Jordan says, "Well, this law is unconstitutional, therefore, we need to put a."
Not just Jen Jordan, Chuck Martin.
When you put a law in saying how much something's going to cost. What's that called?
A fiscal note?
Fiscal note.
Oh, yeah.
Therefore, you have to add a fiscal note to this bill because we need to know how much the AG's office is going to spend defending this unconstitutional law. Well, I think that's absurd because, first of all, it's not unconstitutional. Just because Jen Jordan et al. Say that it's unconstitutional doesn't mean that it is.
But you just said it's not.
Since every citizen has a right to sue over every bill and everything that becomes law by the Jen Jordan standard, every law would have to have a fiscal note attached to it, which would say how much the Attorney General would have to spend defending it. The Attorney General would have to have a separate office to write fiscal notes.
There is a set threshold on how much the budget office estimates a bill would cost to implement or something like that, in which you then have to attach a fiscal note. So, like, I don't know. And listen, I totally take your point that you're right. We have a Supreme Court of the United States to judge constitutionality. So saying something is unconstitutional is a matter of an opinion. But to be fair, Craig, you did just say she can't just say it's unconstitutional, and you said it's not unconstitutional. So I do think it is a judgment
I'm not
call.
saying it's unconstitutional or not. I'm saying that when a sitting senator declares that it should be a matter of policy simply because she or other members of the minority, mind you, believe that it's unconstitutional, and that should set a wheels in motion to create fiscal notes at all, and et cetera, that seems to me a little absurd.
We had Republicans that voted no as well because
they didn't vote no on the unconstitutionality.
It seemed like a stretch, and obviously this is I'm adding a political question to a constitutional argument, which I love listening to. So I sort of went off on a different angle here.
No, sure.
But I just, when Senator Jordan did that, it was like, oh, come on.
Well, maybe, and I think it might be saying a different way of saying the same thing, but maybe the standard should be when it is extremely likely there's going to be litigation, as in everybody in the world says, oh, yeah, we're challenging this when it's already been challenged, when it's something like this that we know. We regardless of whether you view it as constitutional or unconstitutional, it's going to be challenged. And everyone knew that. It was probably, it would be prudent to have a fiscal note attached to it because we know it about this. I mean, you pass a law, that deals with, watershed management.
Well, that's definitely going to be a lawsuit. I can guarantee you that.
Didn't Brian Kemp specifically say we fully intend on needing to defend this in court? I mean,
sure.
He said that before the
sure,
vote.
but fiscal notes are for what Charlie just laid out. It's about, when the legislature votes on something, understand the budget impact of what they're voting for. And that's why there's a certain threshold of how to include it. I don't know why asking for that here is such a terrible thing. You're talking about changes in tax code here. I mean, like that's something that you should know how much it's going to cost the state of Georgia.
The Jordan standard would establish a fiscal note on every bill that moves through the legislature by her very reasoning, because every law is susceptible to a legal challenge.
Well,
I don't care if it's changing the PSC map or if it's an abortion bill.
And I think if Jen were sitting here, and she's also my friend, I think she would probably say that it's not just when I think it's unconstitutional. I think she would say that, or just when someone else thinks it's going to be unconstitutional, but when the likelihood of litigation is very high.
Yeah,
I think
so
that was
high.
the point.
But again, you can't quantify likelihood, though.
It's tough.
That's the problem.
But
if you have a 50-50 bill, what are you going to do? And what makes a 50-50 bill a 50-50 bill?
Every case I ever tried, I said, look, y'all got a 13th juror here, and that 13th juror is your common sense. And what does your common sense tell you about A, B, or C? So maybe we just use our common sense. If everybody in the building, including Governor Kemp, knows it's going to be challenged, maybe we ought to figure out how much it costs.
Charlie sounds like a good attorney.
Common sense and activities under the gold dome.
All right.
Film at 11.
Good combination.
Yes.
Okay, let's wrap up this lengthy episode with what we are watching in the news this next week. So I'll start with me again, like we do every week. The guest we bring in doesn't know that we do this segment, so we're going to give him plenty of time to
goes
decide.
last.
Figure out something to say.
Yeah, but what we're watching for this next week in news, personally, we've had, since the last time we talked, a couple more District 7 candidates announced on the Republican side that have, again, made some national headlines. We had a African-American military vet release, a kind of hot-button video. Craig, you're shaking your head a little bit. You want to chime in?
I don't think he's going to be much of an influence in the race.
Well, you know me. I go on Twitter reaction. That's how I judge That's how I judge all of my influence on the race decisions. But
I understand.
That race is going to be certainly a ton of fun to watch for the junkies of us. I'm now realizing I actually have a vote in there now for the first time, so I should probably figure that out too. But Hans, what are you looking for this next week?
Well, and before I do mine, I feel like I'll tack on to yours. I was told by a very credible source there is no chance that Renee Unterman does not enter the race.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, it's kind of a matter of time at this point.
Yeah.
And she was, we just talked about the heartbeat bill. She was on the governor's right hand, which is a hard place to be when you sign a piece of major legislation. So, she's positioning herself. But anyways.
All right, so I'll be real short with mine. What I'll be watching for is for when we'll see the next White House daily press briefing. It has now been 58 days, which is a modern record.
Excellent.
40 days and 40 nights.
Yeah. So
that's a modern record?
Yeah, it's a record.
Do you know when, I guess since they started keeping track of that?
So does that date back to the 50s?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Since the start of press briefings.
I know because Eisenhower's press secretary didn't do that much. I just didn't know to quantify it.
Sarah Sanders, the invisible woman.
Craig.
Two things. One, the Biden thing, it intrigues me about his past record. I was watching Hans while he was on his computer there. They're hitting him back all over from things dating all the way back to the 70s. So I'm going to take a step back from a political scientist perspective and look at it and say, have we reached the era? When are you forgiven? How old is it? How old of an issue is too old? If you said XXXXS for 30 years, but you still got that Y sitting all the way in the back, are you still screwed?
And if you say sorry, is it okay?
Yeah, if you say sorry, it's okay. So from a modern campaigning perspective, I think this Biden candidacy will mean a lot and will really show where we go in this century running for president.
Well, and I want to add something real quick, even though we're way over time, because what I've found really interesting is there are some issues that we're all looking at and saying, this is okay to have grown personally and changed your mind, and this is not okay to have grown personally and changed your mind. Like the implication that I've changed my ways on I'm not talking about Biden anymore, but if we talked about like sexual harassment, I changed my ways on sexual harassment, then the voter's going to look at you and be like, okay, so when in your life was that okay?
Sure.
So like now it's not only what you were talking about, there's a differentiation between, what is okay to have shown personal growth in. And I've now come at, like, he's going to experience that with the busing legislation that he supported way back when. He might be able to come out in the primary and say, I've had a personal growth in this issue. And that might be an issue where they say personal growth there is okay. Times have changed, yada, yada. So I don't know. I'm finding that really interesting too. I didn't mean to hijack.
No, that's right. Second thing, state Republican convention is next weekend, 8 days from now.
I'm coming.
Down in Savannah.
I'll be there.
You're more than welcome. River Street, a lot of fun. Friday and Saturday, about 2,000, 2,500 Republicans.
Excellent.
Electing a new chairman.
Bring my autograph book.
There you go.
Are you running for chairman?
God, no. So
are you running for president? Do you want to announce her too? Let's all just go around the room.
I've not ruled it out.
Of course not.
It's a large qualifying fee. I don't think I can get that from my wife.
Charlie.
I guess there's two things. One is we're waiting for Bob Mueller to leave DOJ, and I think most people thought it was going to be mid-May. We're coming into mid-May now. We don't have a date yet, but
that's fascinating.
As soon as he leaves, then doesn't matter what Barr or Trump says. He's a private citizen and can come testify, which I think everyone expects he will. I think when he does come testify in front of Congress, I don't think it would surprise many people. I think there was a poll recently that 3% of the American public has read the 400 pages of the redacted Mueller report. I think that is a lie. It's probably 0.3% have read it. Lindsey Graham's not even read it.
People want to seem smart when they answer their phone and somebody asks them if they read it.
Yeah. We all get information mostly through images and whether those are images online or TV. And the images so far have been the president, have been his what seems to be defense attorney William Barr, and Michael Cohen, who is at best damaged goods. When Bob Mueller sits down and raises his hand and talks, it'll be the first time he does so, and it'll be significant. So that's what I'm looking for, and then I'm also looking for if Kamala Harris gets any bump in the polls from her aggressive questioning of Barr, which received a lot of attention, and her more aggressive posturing, which I think Senator Harris is an excellent candidate, by the way. I'm looking to see if she gets a bump from any of that.
Anything you want to plug before we wrap up? Twitter account, Facebook? Should people follow you on Twitter?
The new firm I joined is Cook & Conley, and you can Google that, and it comes up. Bobby Lee Cook is one of the most famous trial attorneys in the country, and that's who I've joined. I'm opening their Atlanta office, which is on Piedmont Avenue, and if y'all need a lawyer, give us a call.
All right.
And congrats to Hans for buying the Dunwoody Crier. I know it's a couple weeks old, but I didn't have a chance to say congrats.
Thank
you.
Congratulations. I've known that paper a long time.
Thank you.
Yeah, Hans, you don't get to plug anything, and Craig, I don't know if you understand what Twitter is, so we're just going to go and wrap up.
I read other people's Twitter. That's enough for me.
All right. This has been a long edition of the Georgia Politics Podcast. If you got to this point, thank you.
Thanks for sticking with us.
Yeah, please subscribe. Check out the YouTube channel. Hans is going to show up a picture of something magical on the YouTube channel. You only get to see what it is if you watch the video online. So follow us there. Share with your friends. Thanks for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at GAPoliticsPod. We will talk to everybody on the next show. Good Gussie, that was long.
How long? How did that go? How did that get so long?
121.
How did that get so long?
Well, we spent
almost 40 minutes.
40 minutes on the first topic.
Yeah.
I blame the host.
Plan for that.
I blame
We're all
the host.
political junkies. We're not going to shut up about that.